And with that little media slam, let me hand it over to Brandon. Brandon, I would like for you to jump in here, being our both very handsome and extremely intelligent man who prepped our briefing papers on our deep dive segment, which we're going to start with Turkey. We're going to give you some base information on Turkey, and then we're going to move from that into the recent coup, which is just the first in a long line, the last in a long line of coups. That sounds more terrifying than it actually is. And we are going to pivot from that into a discussion about democracy, how we talk about the Middle East, how we talk about freedom fighters, coups, and all of these things, and bring it full circle to the 9/11 report. So, Brandon, please get us some groundwork of Turkey.
As soon as you unmute, we'll be good to go.
Okay, so where do you want to start? Do you want to start with at the
Let's
end?
get some groundwork. What is Turkey?
Well, turkey is a type of poultry, and often you eat it at Thanksgiving along with certain sides. But the country Turkey, or the Republic of Turkey as we know it today, was founded in 1924 following the ousting of the Sultan after a series of reformists known as the Young Turks, which is where the channel takes its name from, decided that they should follow Western Europe's example in creating a secular democracy, a secular nation, a republic, a democratic republic. So in 1909, they ousted the Caliph, the Sultan at the time, and replaced him with another up until 1922, where they eventually came up with their first constitution. Well, their second constitution, but they're the one that's most relevant today. So in 1922 to 24, the most important reforms were made, which would turn Turkey into a democratic republic where people had the right to vote. In 1935, the last of the reforms started by a man named Ataturk, from which the country takes its name, because prior to that it was the Ottoman Empire, was instituted. And those reforms turned Turkey into a secular democracy. And during the time and even until today, lots of Middle Eastern countries are mostly Muslim, and there is no sort of separation between church and state. So Ataturk's reforms turned Turkey into a very, very secular democracy. It removed all mentions of Islam from the government. It instituted government control of religious institutions. Prior to that point, many parts of Turkey had their own little autonomy, so there were different sects and religious leaders in different townships who had control over that township and religious courts and religious schools, and those reforms wiped those out, replacing them with secular courts, secular schools, secular national government.
Okay, so Turkey's foundation is actually secularism. It's actually based as much as they can on a Western European model of how society should be.
Yes, Turkey is incredibly secular, and it's worth mentioning that by 1935, Turkey had 18 members of parliament who were women. They had female judges, and this was a time in Western Europe where some countries still had not allowed women to have the vote. So Turkey was quite progressive at the time, not only in the Middle East, but in Europe as well, for its secularism, for its legal equality for females.
I wanted to mention for the United States, it was roughly in the late 1870s when it was first pitched as a constitutional amendment to give women the right to vote. It was about 40 years later in 1920 when we finally ratified the amendment with enough states to give women the right to vote. So just slightly sooner than than Turkey did. So I wanted to put that in for reference.
Yeah, definitely. And so this means that Turkey was founded on a vision from a man called Ataturk, which Turkey, as far as I know, is also named after. And this vision of a secular Western modeled country have survived up until very recently due to them actually having two constitutions, one that Ataturk provided and a second that the military has. The military actually has its own constitution for how to operate, including in domestic cases. And that has led to a series of coups. Is that correct, Brendan?
Yes, absolutely. The military in Turkey is a bit distinct from the military, so say in United States, where they have a lot of the military in Turkey has a lot of influence over domestic policies as opposed to simply foreign policies, and there is also no civilian head up until recently of military of the Turkish military. So where you say the President of the United States of America is the technical civilian head of the military. He is not a military official. He is a civilian official.
Mm-hmm.
Turkey does not have that. Turkey's military branch, from a symbolic and I guess performative aspect, views themselves as the guardians of Ataturk's vision for Turkey. Like they come in and step in when they feel like the democratically elected government has strayed too far out from Ataturk's vision, with either military coups, like actual violent overthrows, or with sort of lists of demand under the threat of further coup.
Now, here's the kicker. So usually when you see military in the Middle East emboldened like this, with powers like this, you see coups and then the military stays in power, or they get some puppet to sit in front of them. But this has actually not been the case in Turkey's history. They have at all times returned control to a civilian and democratically elected government. However, it has also resulted in a slow erosion of civil liberties, and it has also resulted in, or at least some blame, the military being too diligent with regards to cracking down on religious parties and even leftist parties as the reason for the current prime minister. Now, Brandon, can you give us a bit of a background on the current prime minister?
Well, the current prime minister is named Erdogan. He was elected prime minister. Well, first he was the mayor of Istanbul from in the late 90s, where he eventually lost his position in the wake of the 1997 coup in Turkey. So there was the most recent coup in Turkey was in 1997, prior to this coup, obviously. And it led to the ousting of the Democratic elected government at the time. The spark for that coup, if I'm not mistaken, was a series of reforms that the government had made that led to, I guess it would be seemingly minuscule to us, but in Turkey, one of the big issues is that religious garb is banned from schools and universities, and the government there had been allowing religious garb in universities. They had been funding local mosques, and the military felt that that was outside of Ataturk's vision, so they went in and took over. At that exact same time, in 1998, Erdogan, who by all accounts is an Islamist, he believes in a sort of political Islam and the rule of Islam over the state, was the mayor of Istanbul, and he presented a poem in public that was described as Islamist and promoting political Islam. He was thrown in jail for 4 months and banned from politics for 5 years. Eventually, in 2001, he started the AKP party. So the AKP party is the Labor and Development Party in Turkey. I'm sorry, no, the Justice and Development Party in Turkey. And it was started in 2001 and by Erdogan. In 2002, they were able to garner 2/3 of the House, of the Parliament in Turkey, due to some sort of democratic manipulation that was, while not rigging the system, they only won over 1/3 of the popular vote, but they got 2/3 of the seats because of an obscure rule that exists in Turkey where you have to have 10% of electorate in order to garner any seats. So they ended up with 2/3 of it. It's complicated.
Okay. So let's quickly touch on the Kurds and on Turkey's recent role with ISIS and bombings in Syria. So The Kurds, as far as I remember, make up about 20% of the population, but is not a recognized independent minority. That has some effects. Can you touch on those real quick?
Yes, there's only three official minority groups as per the constitution of Turkey. One of them is the Armenians, which is another group that Turkey has a long violent history with, the Armenian genocide, which is something that Erdogan has also not acknowledged despite claiming that he would, but that's a different story. The Kurds make up 20% of the population of Turkey, and because they're not a recognized minority group, they are not given the same protection as groups like the Armenians are, which means they can't, uh, which means they cannot teach their language officially in their own school. So if you say you have a Kurdish town, you can't teach the children in Kurdish. You have to teach them in Turkish, Arabic, stuff like that
Yeah.
language. And there's also been a lot of brutal repression of the Kurdish people by the Turkish government, which has been met with resistance by the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, which is comes to butt heads with the Turkish government over a lot of issues. And because of Erdogan renounced his Islamist nature when he took over control of the government in 2002, but as prime minister, he said that was behind him. But a lot of his actions after that have led people to believe that that's not true. Specifically, recently, his connection to ISIL and ISIS by providing them comfort, having lax border security. Um, uh, some accuse him of actually lending actual aid, weapons, and finances to ISIL. So that's a big issue as well. And a lot of people credit that for the increase in terrorism, along with the continued antagonism with the Kurdish people for the increase in terrorist attacks in Turkey. So you have two prongs that are attacking Turkish people, or rather, it's the Turkish state, rather. You have
Mm.
ISIL, who sees the state as still being secular, despite the fact that it has a theoretically Islamist as the head of the state. And you have the
Mhm.
Kurdish people who are attacking the state because it refuses to acknowledge them as a legitimate group.
Okay. So, and you also have some. In recent years, Erdogan has used his powers and terrorist attacks, like not on the scale like the one in the airport in Istanbul, but terrorist attacks like those. And it should be mentioned that the Kurds in Turkey, they have a political party, and that political party has a military wing. And even though that military wing operates outside of Turkey, Erdogan reportedly, when they joined the war in Syria, instead of actually sending planes to bomb ISIS, they sent planes to bomb the Kurdish military forces that had taken refuge in mountains in Syria. And there's also been many reports on Turkey actually buying oil from ISIS, giving them a source of revenue. Uh, but he has each time used these security attacks as a means to increase his power and the state's power and curb civil liberties. It is, for example, they have tried to make it illegal to criticize his political party and illegal to criticize the government. So this brings us, this gives us a bit of background information to work off. So let's take it to this coup. So what actually transpired here? So this coup was yet another taken by the military, or is it by a group of the military? There are varying reports. What is your take on it, Brandon?
This is actually it's not complicated. It's just really, it's mired in conspiracy. So let's try to just unweave the conspiracy that's going on and like deal with the facts if we can understand them, and based in historical tradition. So we know that uh, Erdogan is A, curbing civil liberties, and B, without a doubt, turning Turkey more towards having having Islamic iconography, Islamic control of the state. So far, what he's done is he's campaigned to put taxes on alcohol and tobacco, which would be a symbolic ban as Islam would call for. He has advocated for allowing religious garb to be worn at universities, mosque funding, issues like that. From a more structural standpoint, he has reduced the powers of the military. So he has replaced the head of the the national military panel with a civilian head. And what this panel is actually in charge of doing is every month, the government officials will come in to talk to the panel and justify the decisions they've made with the secular vision of the country. So Erdogan has curtailed military power for the past few years while increasing the power of the police, who act as his sort of, I don't say secret police because they're actual police force, but who have been in charge of silencing secular opposition to Erdogan in Turkey.
Okay, so let me sum up. He came into power in a dubious election. He tried to legislate his moral, religious values, and he used attacks on his country as excuses to curb civil liberties. So, are we certain that George Bush didn't just run for president in another country?
Okay, well, it's a little bit more complicated. So Erdogan is actually pretty well. He was popular because prior to Erdogan, there was an economic recession in Turkey, and post Erdogan, we saw an economic boom of 7% for the past while he was in power. So that provided him with the sort of popularity to, even if the first election was dubious, AKP was able to stay in power on this sort of economic success, the new economic success of Turkey.
I just wanted to hop in. Sorry about the echo. I don't know what's causing it. It might be Nis, or I think Google might be just waiting to figure. There it is. The noise canceling on Google had to catch up. Anyway, what I was going to say was that part of that economic boom, and I didn't have a chance to look up the details precisely, but is definitely in part to the U.S. using Turkey as a launching pad for operations in the Middle East. So I know we haven't quite gotten to that part yet, but you mentioned George Bush, and so that just came to my mind about how much billions of dollars have been funneling into Turkey as a result of our ongoing involvement in the Middle East.
Yeah, and so the economic success coupled with the traditional curbing of democracy overall by the military led, especially in also Islamic religion in Turkey and leftist organizations in Turkey, led to Erdogan taking over. Now, this particular coup is said to be the work of a group known as Ergenekon, which may or may not actually exist. And this is where things get kind of complicated. So the military is probably trying to kill Erdogan or trying to get him out of power because they have seen their power deteriorate. They have seen Turkey become more Islamic as a nation in the government. So it makes sense that if we know the history of Turkey, that they would be trying to get Erdogan out. However, Erdogan in the past has used the military's traditional atrocities, such as the 1980 coup, which led to hundreds of thousands of Turkish citizens, mostly youth, being tortured and killed by the military, as an excuse to target his secular opponents who have no ties to any kind of conspiracy by labeling them as part of this McCarthy-esque communist red threat, but without the communism. It's a secular threat. So yes, there is a group of people trying to kill or oust Erdogan. I don't know if they want to kill him, trying to oust Erdogan. But the amount of people who are actually in it versus the people who are being accused and targeted and oppressed under the guise of preventing these coups is a big discrepancy. So we've seen in 2008 and 2010 two examples of Erdogan using the guise of military conspiracy to get rid of political opponents, journalists, activists, anyone who he deemed a threat. And this past coup, he's referred to this coup as a gift from God, and he has already ousted tens of thousands of teachers and judges and deans of universities who he deemed as threats, and he has arrested several thousand military officials and government officials already. So it's a little bit, it's where reality meets fiction.
Okay, so uh, I mean, seen by Western standards, both the military and Erdogan are the sinners here. But a fun fact is that back in 2004, a survey of the Turkish people found that the military was the most trusted governmental institution in the country, the most trusted institution of any kind in the country. That changed in 2011 when reports of what had actually transpired during some of the military coups started coming out. But so the military acting like it is not something new in the Turkish history. Now, for people of power to act like Erdogan is doing is also not something new. I made the reference to Bush, but you can make that reference to almost anyone who wants to infer more power upon himself or herself or a certain ideology, a way of thinking, a way of living. So let's try and take this Turkey coup and the way that it is being used and abused and talked about, and let's try and pivot it out a bit. So after 9/11, all anyone and everyone could talk about was 9/11 and how 9/11 justified insider trading on Wall Street. 9/11 justified a temporary suspension of civil liberties. 9/11 justified enhanced interrogation techniques being applied. 9/11 justified Nixon, Cheney, sorry, sorry Nixon, I really didn't mean to compare you to him. Cheney to somehow manipulate himself into the netherworld of the shadow world between the executive branch and the legislative branch, where he could do damn well whatever he pleased. So, what is it about these kinds of tragedies or attacks that that is so universal that anyone and everyone can use it in the same way?
I know what came to my mind when you were mentioning how 9/11 was used to justify so many things is I think there may have been more to the concept of never let a good crisis go to waste, that quote that came out, than I think a lot of people attributed to it. I think the using of crisis to rationalize, justify, pass over, glance by, or just turn a blind eye towards altogether, so many different things, I think had to have been an intentional had to be an intentional effort to capitalize on that opportunity as it was seen in that light. And I think with the 28 pages and with the coup in Turkey, and as was mentioned, like that he might be buying oil from ISIL and or might be providing some aid in one way or another, that might be able to be providing aid in one way or another, that ISIL is quite literally fighting with quite a bit of U.S. arms, and that either that were given towards the people that were supposed to fight them and that they took them, or were just left unattended in storage unit or storage houses and things like that. So, and really that's been a theme throughout basically everyone we've fought since the end of Vietnam, give or take, that pretty much everybody that we've gone to war with has been fighting with weapons that either we left there earlier, sold to them, or just gave them. And so, or gave to an opposing faction that faded away and are now under possession of the people that were fighting. And so we've done quite a bit to aid the enemy ourselves with our foreign policy, intentionally or not.
Okay, so there's a question in chat from Jean Lapossiere. What's the end game for the Middle East? And I would like to take this a bit apart. First of all, Turkey, until after the Second World War, was actually as much in Europe as it was not in Europe. And the part of it that is not in Europe is not in the Middle East, it's in Asia. So That's just to like break apart that misconception. Most Muslims actually live outside what we talk about as the Middle East. The next step I would like to take in picking apart that question is the end game for the Middle East. You might as well be talking about what is the end game for democracy. I mean, how does democracy finally win, or how does it finally lose? You can't read. Civilization is not a progressive up the curve. At some point, we reach perfection. It's all up and down. Democracy was the biggest thing in Athens until it lost and it disappeared. Then it tried to reemerge as a representative democracy in Rome. Then that died and became an empire that lasted for 1,000 years. And then it still took 600 years before democracy was again rediscovered, talked about, and finally tried to be re-implemented. And now we find out that, oh, that was actually not democracy. That was just a big fat illusion of managed democracy, like Putin calls his version of democracy. So the end game for the Middle East, there is no end game. This is human civilization. It will pass on through time. It will change. It will go up and it will go down. Now we have our morals and values that we should rightfully so fight for. But that does not mean that we should rightfully fight for our right to stuff it down someone else's throat.